Hello, everyone. My name is Tara Zara. I am one of the co-hosts of this series of events on globalization and deglobalization in Central Europe, along with my colleague, Peter Becker, who is one of the from the University of Vienna, who is one of the presenters today. I wanted to just start off by thanking the sponsors of this event and this series, which includes first and foremost the Center for East European and Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago, and Esther Peters, who's been providing all of our logistical and technical and organizational support. I also want to thank the Franke Institute of Humanities, the Posen Center for Human Rights, the Chicago-Vienna Faculty Grant Program, and the University of Vienna for supporting us in this endeavor. Just a quick word about how we'll be proceeding. We'll have 3 presentations today by our 3 panelists. Each will be about 10 minutes long. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A. And the best way to ask a question would be to type it into the Q&A box or the chat box. We'll be monitoring those, and once the presentations are over, I'll read out the questions to the panelists so that we can get the maximum number of questions in. I'm going to just start us off quickly by introducing all 3 panelists at once in the order that they'll be speaking. So our first speaker will be Charles Fawell. He is a PhD candidate in history here at the University of Chicago, where he's currently finishing his dissertation entitled In Between Empires, Transit, Sovereignty Along the Maritime Highways of the French Empire, 1870 to 1930. We have sort of included the French Empire as a part of Central Europe for the purposes of today's panel, because Charlie's research is so very relevant to the questions that interest us. Our second panelist will be Peter Becker, who is University Professor of Austrian History at the University of Vienna. And his research focuses on cultural and political history of 19th and 20th century Europe. He also works on state politics and social integration in the Habsburg monarchy and its successor states, as well as internationalism in the Habsburg monarchy and in the First Austrian Republic. And then finally, our third speaker is David Petrucelli, who completed his bachelor's degree at Brown University and his PhD at Yale, after which he spent time as a postdoctoral fellow at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. Currently, he is an assistant professor at Dartmouth and is completing a manuscript on international crime in interwar Europe. He's also published several articles and book chapters related to this research. Okay, I'm gonna turn the floor over to Charlie. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. I'm gonna try to share a PowerPoint. Does everybody see that okay? Good. All right, well, yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone in attendance. So my paper looks at for deglobalization and anti-globalism in the somewhat unlikely place of the late 19th and early 20th century ocean liner. And I say unlikely because the ocean liner was probably the definitive instrument and icon of global integration in this period. And while steamships never ceased, obviously, to be instruments of global integration, their role as icons of internationalism, I think, was much less stable, and that's what I want to explore today. And so specifically, I'll be arguing that the ocean liner went from being primarily an object of enchantment, able to incarnate an international order very powerfully, to an object of critique, and that this transition began in earnest in the opening decade of the 20th century before rapidly accelerating with the war. So the first obvious question then is, what did the ocean liner represent before 1900, more or less? And to answer that, I reconstruct kind of a myth of the late 19th century ocean liner through the eyes of its most enchanted, Whiggish admirers, right? The maritime magnates, the port city politicians, the Globetrotters. And I argue that if you read along the grain of the travelogues that those Globetrotters were spinning out, the ocean liners' publicity, the layouts of steamships, that the late 19th century ocean liner comes across from those kinds of sources as that rare space that was capable of simultaneously embodying national, international, and colonial projects, and in some sense of resolving tensions between the three. So you can start with the ocean liner's ability to stand in for the nation, right? I think by the 1890s, essentially as soon as steamships' engineering hurdles had been cleared sufficiently for designers to think about small aesthetic details, steamships rapidly became showcases of national pride. And in that showcase, you had a kind of an equation of past glory of the nation and future glory of the nation, both inside the steamship. And so just one example, the Louis XIV room, the Sun King room in one of the major transatlantic French liners there on the left, and this allegorical painting in the first class smoking room of a Norddeutscher Lloyd steamship showing the German Empire being carried out to sea, where its future lies. But beyond decor, Europe's major shipping companies, all of whom depended to varying degrees on state contracts and government subsidies, they were very successful at telling their stories as triumphs of nation making, in which private industry and national imperatives served each other in this kind of virtuous cycle that was mediated by growing bourgeois shareholder publics. You know, it was they, the private shipping companies, that carried the emblems, the flag of the nation, the diplomats of the nation. They carried the mail that connected emigrants to homelands, that connected colonies to metropoles. They stepped in times of emergency to carry war material and wounded soldiers and the like, always for pay, even if it took a while. But while ocean liners were perfect objects of the nation in this sense, their value, it's important to remember, derived from being part of an international order, right? Their national qualities had to be validated by foreign passengers and foreign presses. And passengers of the late 19th century, even maybe especially high bureaucrats, generals, they shopped around with surprisingly little loyalty to national lines. In fact, the entertainment for this upper echelon of passenger was in large part the game of endlessly comparing amenities, technology, and co-passengers on the lines of different nations. So again, I think if you go along the grain of the 19th century travelogue, the ocean liner comes off very similar to a floating national pavilion at a kind of a permanent international exposition. These were showcases in that sense of nation making, a nation making that collectively formed an international order. And I think that processions of flag-bearing ocean liners, in a sense, they made it possible to imagine a world of commensurable nations competing peacefully for the betterment of mankind. And so this vision thrived maybe above all in the North Atlantic, where it was semi-institutionalized in racing tournament-style competitions and the like. But it had its parallel in the Trans-Suez Canal maritime highways that connected Europe to Asia. On those routes in those ocean liners, passengers were treated to a kind of an experience of European condominium over the rest of the world. So liners, for instance, divided passengers and crews generally into European and non-European, obviously facing national divisions, ethno-religious divisions in the process. Those quote unquote non-European crews, meanwhile, tended to be recruited with little connection to imperial affiliation. These were very much trans-imperial labor networks that were filling the ocean liners with workers. And once on board, those same workers were compartmentalized, right, according to ideas of race and character. And they were portrayed as being under the close and I would argue cooperative European supervision and tutelage. So workers of races that were stereotyped as aggressive were placed generally out of view in the engine rooms, while workers of races stereotyped as unthreatening tended to be in the service sector, often in costume on kind of permanent display. And layover rituals added to this kind of this feeling of imperial domination and that fed into European camaraderie, I guess you could say. For instance, you have here the ubiquitous practice, especially in the ports of Aden and Colombo on this Trans-Suez maritime highway, of arriving in the port and throwing coins from the upper decks and watching as young men and boys fought amongst each other, dived. dove incredibly deeply, pushed off sharks. This was something that Travelux described passengers of all nationalities bonding over the pure entertainment of this. So in short, by 1900, I argue that the ocean liner as an object, as an experience, as a symbol, allowed elite European travelers to envision a kind of a stable world order in which the nation-making projects of building ocean liners and setting them out to sea collectively formed a kind of a proto-internationalism akin to the International Exposition, and which in the process kind of depoliticized colonialism and effaced imperial rivalries, indeed turned colonialism into a kind of an entertainment. And I think you can kind of bookend this period, as I do at least, as a tentative effort with the opening of the Suez Canal, the international procession that opened the Suez Canal, and the international alliance that set out to crush the Boxer uprising in China in 1900, which had elaborate ceremonies around the departure of ocean liners. But powerful as it was, this world order conjured up by the steamship, I don't think survived the early 20th century, right? And so what changed? In the paper, I go through a number of culprits, but for time's sake, let's just look at two. So first, the steamship became ensnared in anti-migrant backlashes that were unfolding from Australia to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to the US and Canada. These are anti-migration movements that had been brewing since at least the 1880s, but only in the opening decades of the 20th century did they start to actually succeed in convincing governments to intervene directly and sanction steamships and steamship companies, for instance, fining them when they committed migration infractions. And as waves of journalistic exposés painted ocean liners as floating slums and hubs of white slavery, national lines, I think it's fair to say, lost some of their patriotic pomp, instead appearing increasingly like Trojan horses for a variety of ills and nationless servants of capital. But the second enormous factor is that the ocean liner went to war. And in so doing, it kind of broke the delicate balance between its national, international, and colonial dimensions. One by one, the belligerent nations, national governments nationalized their merchant marines. And in so doing, they, even though they papered over the disputes that followed after the war, the kind of voluntaristic, gentlemanly pact between private shipping companies and states had been exposed as rather outdated, and instead force and national emergency had taken the day. And inside ocean liners during the war that were pulled into wartime service, you can also see the kind of high imperial condominium breaking down as, on the one hand, African and Asian workers started to maneuver fairly aggressively to try to take advantage of the kind of dependency of European shipping lines on their work. And simultaneously, as European labor movements stepped up campaigns targeting African and Asian workers, now arguing that they were in fact security hazards during wartime, that they were not loyal enough to the nation to serve, nor honorable enough to rescue passengers that were being increasingly shipwrecked by torpedo attacks, especially in the Mediterranean theater is what I'm thinking of. So in the war's aftermath, as reparations are seizing and gifting ocean liners to the victors, little remained of that ethos of the floating pavilion at an international exposition, or that showcase of high imperial condominium. And almost as if in reaction to these anti-migration movements, these ruptures in the international order, steamship companies started to advertise or perfect the advertising of the steamship as a non-place, where time melted away, where people were freed from every burden to do exactly as they liked, where passengers could escape the real world and care only for themselves. And so obviously I think that to some extent denationalized and flattened the ocean liner in the process. But as much as such advertising suggested that world shipping had moved on from the internationalist pomp, I think it's worth considering, by way of conclusion, the attempts of actors outside of Europe, North America, and Japan to launch international shipping lines of their own, especially between 1914 and 1940. And in so doing, in a sense, they were trying to redeem the belly book promise of maritime internationalism. So if you take figures like Gurdit Singh, for instance, a Sikh entrepreneur who tried to build an Indo-Pacific line in 1914, only to be harassed and persecuted by officials in Canada and India, or a figure like Marcus Garvey, whose 1919 Black Star line collapsed under similar circumstances, I think you glimpse a flashback to that apogee of ocean liner internationalism. with exuberant hopes that ships could crystallize a nation-making project and find a place for it in an international order for which the free seas was an ideal venue. And when similar ventures broke out to break into world shipping occurred in interwar Dutch Indonesia, for instance, in British East Africa, the Chinese seaboard, surely elsewhere as well, they crashed to varying degrees against the solidarity of European, American, sometimes Japanese shipping cartels. And so the last thing I'd say is that I think there are many ways to interpret these widespread bids to perhaps truly globalize the world's shipping lanes, but their failure might be seen as a prime, if deeply ironic, example of interwar deglobalization. After all, these attempts to redeem the promises of steamship internationalism were stopped short by the very imperial condominium that had championed a form of it in the first place. Thank you.
Peter, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Great. Thank you, Tara, for the introduction and also for managing this this virtual conference project so excellently together with Esther. And unfortunately, we are on this virtual level and not meeting in person, but times will change, hopefully. I'm presenting you a short argument about passports as instruments of globalization without a PowerPoint. And you just have to imagine yourself holding your passport. I just wanted to show you mine briefly, but by that, I just realized that I lost track of my passport. In times of COVID, I think it's not this dramatic, but I think when times change, I think I'll need to find it back. In writings about globalization, the concept of embeddedness plays an important role. It has received its fair share of attention, even in reflections on the dynamics of deglobalization. Harold James vividly changes John Rudge's characterization of the international order as embedded liberalism into embedded unilateralism. This variegation captures to him well the more recent changes in the global order. Being embedded refers here to regulations which reach beyond the single state. This means that globalization is not just coeval with openness to merchandise, services, capital, and people from abroad. It is equally connected to, I quote, a complex system of regulating all these flows, end quote, as Harold James argues. I would like to use the logic of James' argument for a fresh look at the years after the end of the Great War, when the return to 19th century globalization was on the political agenda. The interruption of the flow of people and goods was one of the many challenges for post-war states brought about by the Great War. There is a widely shared consensus that the modern passport system, which endured until the implementation of the Schengen Agreement, was born out of the political, social, and economic catastrophe of the Great War. It was based on two features. First, continuation of state control of movement, both from its nationals and from foreigners. And second, the standardization of the instruments used by the states to implement their control strategies. Looking at the emergence of the modern passport system, I would like to give Harold James' argument an additional twist. Contrary to his reasoning that, I quote, deglobalization is facilitated by a mode of thinking that regards general rules of the sort required for effective international coordination as redundant, ineffective, or even harmful, end quote, the reduction of freedom of mobility of people required general rules decided in international conferences which were sponsored by the League of Nations. And I would like to look at the conjuncture of intensified international regulation and deglobalization at the beginning of a new era in international governance. The modern passport system emerged in the 1920s as a successful bid to overcome the far-reaching restrictions on mobility established during the war. With the support of the international business community, tourism industry, and the media, the League of Nations tried hard until 1926 to orchestrate a return to the open borders of the pre-war years. They were open, especially for people with at least modest means, who could travel between continents and within the better parts of Europe rather unmolested. From the perspective of the early 1920s, these were fairy tale-like conditions, and they were also addressed as such. The Transit Committee of the League of Nations was a crucial enabling factor in this process. Its result was, however, far from the envisioned return to the pre-war system of open borders. Why failed the League to deliver? Representatives of powers, proud of their liberal traditions and respect for individual rights, found it impossible to revert to pre-war conditions. The three conferences convened by the League were nevertheless not a complete failure. Most of the states were ready and willing to try to regulate existing conditions. The result was an important step towards the standardized modern passport system. We all are familiar with the continuation of the story, holding ourselves passports with different purchasing power on the international travel market. We are all testimonials for the claim made by George Soros that the free movement of capital was even at the height of globalization, accompanied by strong regulations of the movement of people. Movements of millions of people are structured through the passport regime, which emerged around the mid-1920s. It helped scholars to meet, businessmen and businesswomen to make deals, and tourists to support local economies worldwide. Were passports thus not just a blessing for their holders? This was at least the position presented by the British delegate at the 1926 conference in Geneva. Sperling, the British minister to Bern, contested the assumption that the abolition of all passports would be a sign of progress, by emphasizing that, I quote, a passport was one of the most useful possessions that a traveler abroad could possibly have. Even the British representative had to concede to critical responses that his government was strongly interested in keeping the control over the movement of its people, which the war had bestowed on them. What does this imply? It means, first, that we have to relate the origin of the modern passport system to the war and its radical expansion of state intervention, where far-reaching cooperations in the field of transport and commodity exchange were restricted to states being united in the fight against their enemy. It means, second, that the modern passport system was a conscious break with the free movement of the pre-war period. This free movement had been an important feature of the first phase of intensified globalization. It had helped people to move, not just for migration purposes, but also for tighter collaboration in the fields of science, business, and culture. Just think of the global attendance at world fairs and their scholarly artistic programs, or at the fact-finding missions of social scientists and governance experts crossing the Atlantic in both directions on steamships. This is certainly not a new point to make. I will argue, however, that this break with a globalized past was based on, I quote, the complex set of rules and international coordination, which is related by Harold James and others to globalization and not to deglobalization. This twist makes the passport an interesting topic for our discussion. It makes us aware of the fact that restrictions in the sense of an intensified control over the flow of capital, goods, or people might require equally well-structured regulations than the expansion of these flows. The modern passport system will be discussed here, for want of a better expression, as an instance of embedded constraints, to give the concept of Raji another twist. Setting constraints for the acting of its citizens is part of the sovereign power of each state. During the Great War, governments excelled in this respect. Norms are always embedded, either within a constitutional framework or during the Great War within the rationale of war making. Attempts to negotiate constraints for its own citizens on an international level was difficult to achieve before the war. Just think of the rather futile attempts of reaching an agreement on the fight against anarchism, or the only slightly more successful treaty to combat white slave trade. The modern passport regime meant from this perspective a real innovation. The readiness of a large number of states across the entire globe to embed their internal restrictions regarding individual mobility within an international system of norms and regulation. And in closing, I would like to argue or put up an argument where I think that this is not an argument or kind of a paper dealing with globalization, but with deglobalization. I think it deals with deglobalization for two reasons. First, I do not understand globalization and deglobalization as dichotomies, but rather as processes of increased and decreased connectivity. And the reduction in connectivity requires international regulation. And for this reason, I think passports as a form of embedded constraints can be reflected within the conceptual framework of deglobalization. And I'm very much looking forward to your critical comments on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Just a quick reminder, we already have one question in the Q&A, but you can type a question into the Q&A or the chat at any point. And now we're going to turn the floor over to David Petrucelli. Thanks.
Thank you. I should be sharing my PowerPoint. Hopefully it shares now. Okay, so I'm going to start in Geneva in January 1931, when a man named Bruno Schultz of the Vienna police appeared before the League of Nations Opium Advisory Committee to discuss the nature of the illicit drug trade. And he said, quote, "In truth, this is a question of cosmopolitan criminals who know neither nationality nor morality, spread, unfortunately, to the entire civilized world." Officially, Schultz had come to Geneva as Austria's newly appointed representative to this committee. Unofficially, he had come to represent a body known as the International Criminal Police Commission, today known as Interpol. His appearance in Geneva came at a turning point in the international community's approach to narcotics. Drugs like cocaine, morphine, and heroin had once been treated as miracle cures for a range of ailments as easily accessible products. Over the course of the 1920s, they were subject first to a growing set of international controls, and this turned to increasing criminal sanctions by the 1930s. And so he was speaking right at the beginning of this era of criminalization. So what I want to argue today is that the League of Nations laid the legal and the ideological foundations of our modern drug control system. This is a field of activity that is often overlooked of the League of Nations. And I think recognizing the importance of the League in drug control forces us to re-examine the relationship between internationalism, by which I mean the idea that close international cooperation was necessary to solve shared problems facing the world, and globalization, by which I mean growing social, economic, political interconnectedness or integration of the world. So the League of Nations, as we've just heard, was founded after the First World War, and one of its missions was to restart this wave of globalization from the late 19th century that had stalled out with the First World War. And it did this in a range of fields that it undertook to lift wartime restrictions. We just heard about migration, also an economic activity to get states back onto the gold standard. Narcotic drugs represented an exception to this general approach. Narcotics were in many ways emblematic of the late 19th century wave of globalization. Large globally oriented pharmaceutical firms marketed drugs like heroin and cocaine to the world's consumers as cures for various problems, or put them into popular tonics. So you can see here advertisements of heroin for coughs, or cocaine. If someone had a toothache, you might give your kids cocaine. As you can imagine, with these applications of drugs, by the early 20th century, there were rising rates of addiction in many countries. And this led to calls for regulation, both domestically within countries and at the international level, for some form of international regulation of these products. The proponents of drug controls eventually succeeded in having an obligation to control these products, written into a convention that was aimed principally at the opium trade in East Asia in 1912. And after the First World War, the peacemakers who met in Paris wrote an obligation to ratify this Hague Opium Convention of 1912 into the various treaties ending the war. And this made drug control virtually universal, since so many of the world's states signed on to this peace settlement. The treaties also charged the League of Nations, the newly founded league, with the implementation of this system. And the league established a permanent committee called the Opium Advisory Committee to deliberate on this problem. And over the next 20 years, this OAC, Opium Advisory Committee, would effectively set the global agenda on drugs. Broadly speaking, we can divide the League of Nations approach to drug controls into two phases. The first phase in the 1920s through the early 1930s was marked by an attempt by the League of Nations to control pharmaceutical production. The key figure in this phase was a man named Malcolm Delavine. He was a British representative to the OAC, and he was a Home Office bureaucrat. He believed that the crux of the problem of drug abuse, of addiction, was excess production by pharmaceutical firms. He thought that pharmaceuticals were producing too much cocaine, too much heroin, and this was slipping out into black markets. So he believed that they had to be controlled, total pharmaceutical output. And he believed that any solution had to be international, because the global nature of this trade meant that it would thwart any domestic efforts to control drugs. And he had overseen the implementation of domestic drug controls within Britain during the war and immediately after the war. And he was frustrated by drugs still moving about on the illicit market. So he launched a lengthy publicity campaign within the League of Nations. And this led to two major conventions that had his fingerprints all over them in 1925 and 1931. And together, these established the broad legal framework for drug controls that exist until today. The conventions distinguish between a very narrow set of legitimate uses of drugs, medical and scientific purposes, as they called them, and they banned all other uses of opiates and of cocaine. They introduced a system of certificates to track raw materials and refined drugs through the production process and through trade networks to ensure that the flows of these drugs only were going to legitimate purposes. And the treaties also set up a set of international institutions that existed alongside the League, who were formally separate from the League, that were tasked with overseeing the entire system. So this drug control system was a landmark achievement for the League of Nations. And one League official later wrote that it, quote, resulted in a planned economy for the whole of the drug industry, by which he meant the whole global drug industry. So as this quotation suggests, I think drug controls ran counter to this broader agenda of pushing to restart globalization that existed before the war. In this field, at least, the League was working to impose strict limitations on the flow of goods, of drugs, and they wanted to prevent the reestablishment of the freewheeling kind of globalized markets that they believed had fed addiction before and immediately after the First World War. So that was the first phase of drug control by the League. The second phase of drug control responded more or less directly to the failings of this first phase. Delavine's project succeeded in the aim of controlling pharmaceutical production, which now was not leaking out in large quantities onto illicit markets for recreational purposes, but it didn't succeed in its underlying aim of actually eliminating recreational drug use. After the pharmaceutical firms were brought under control, illicit drug traffickers began to set up their own factories to produce drugs. They found their own supplies of raw materials, and they developed trade networks in order to shuttle these drugs to consumers around the world. So in a sense, a vast globalized shadow economy now grew up as a counterpoint to this planned global economy that the League had tried to establish. And after 1931, the League of Nations cast about for new models for drug control that could deal with this problem. And this is when Bruno Schultz, who I began with, came to Geneva. Schultz was a leading figure within Interpol, as I've mentioned, And this body, Interpol, had been founded in 1923 by the head of the Vienna police, a man named Johannes Schober. Schober and Schultz often depicted this institution as a solution to a very old problem, as an almost inevitable solution. Since the late 19th century, Europe's police officials had warned of the great danger posed by international criminals, these criminals who could move across borders, while police were constrained by their respective jurisdictions. And so they called for better international cooperation about this. I think you could see the way in which the international criminal embodied many of the anxieties of the era about globalization, about this growing interconnectedness of the world, and this idea that state actors could not keep up. So this was a story Interpol also told, but it was only founded after the First World War, after sort of an interruption to this globalization. And I think it was founded in response to very specific post-war circumstances of Central Europe, which made police cooperation urgent. Political collapse, mass dislocations, ongoing paramilitary violence, the drawing and redrawing of boundaries, as you can see here, all led to a surge in cross-border crime. At the same time, the old imperial police networks were fragmented into their respective national units now. And so this left the police ill-equipped to deal with these old criminal networks or new criminal networks that spanned borders. So in 1923, the head of the Vienna police, Johannes Schober, called an international congress, principally interested in police from the region, to reestablish these old police ties. And this meeting established Interpol as an association of police leaders that met regularly to develop common policy. Its program of international policing was largely developed by Bruno Schultz, and he called for the establishment in each state of a national central bureau that would centralize policing and communicate with foreign counterparts. And he also set up an international bureau in Vienna, which served as a sort of clearinghouse for the exchange of information between police services. Now, Interpol began its life as more or less a regional organization of Central European police, but Schober and Schultz hoped to globalize this model of policing. And so they set their eyes on the League of Nations to achieve this. And when Austria was invited to the OAC in 1931 to send a representative, Schober seized on the opportunity. He was then foreign minister of Austria. And so he sent his deputy, Bruno Schultz, to represent him. By this point, Austria had emerged as a center of the European illicit traffic. And this was due to its proximity to pharmaceutical production in the 1920s in Germany and Switzerland, and also to very lax drug laws. But Schultz, as we've seen, suggested a very different explanation. He argued that there were these cosmopolitan criminals, these global actors, who were congregating in Vienna, but were in fact spread across the entire world. The subtext here was clearer to the members of the OAC. Throughout the 1920s, as reports trickled into Geneva about the drug traffic, Jews of Eastern European origin were overrepresented in the files, and they became associated in the minds of many of these drug control advocates with the drug traffic. You can see here an example. And Schultz connected the specific dilemmas of policing post-war Central Europe to the global threat of the international criminal with his speech. And he was also offering at the same time international policing as the key to stamping out this illicit drug trade that was facing the League of Nations officials. So he was suggesting, in other words, that the Interpol's regional model of policing could also serve as a model for the world because of these figures, these mostly Jewish drug traffickers that the League of Nations officials feared. In Geneva, Schultz persistently pushed for this model to be enshrined in international law, and he achieved this with an international treaty in 1936, which targeted drug trafficking. It committed adherents to criminalize the unauthorized trade in drugs and even possession of drugs, and also obligated them to set up central national police bureaus to fight the narcotics, which was a core plank of the Interpol agenda. It also adopted a number of common legal and police norms that Interpol had been pushing for. Now, this treaty is easy to dismiss, and it often has been dismissed, I think, by historians who write about drug controls, because it only entered force in 1939 and never had widespread adoption. But it was, nonetheless, I would argue, a landmark treaty in the evolution of drug controls, because it was the first drug control convention that specifically aimed at narcotics as a criminal problem, as something to be dealt with by criminal law and by policing. And in that sense, it anticipated post-war efforts to fight the drug trade. So to conclude briefly, I think that this evolution of drug controls under the League of Nations shows how internationalism could be turned against globalization in the interwar period. The League began with this mandate to jumpstart the globalizing processes that stalled out during the First World War. But at least with regards to narcotics, it first worked to hinder the reestablishment of globalized markets. And then when these subterranean forces of globalization won out, these drug trafficking networks, the League turned more decisively against globalization, now adopting this vision of the illicit traffic as in in some sense representing a global threat. And I think this was the significance of the quote that I began with, where Bruno Schultz was, in a sense, presenting drug traffickers as cosmopolitan agents of globalization. So I think while we often think of internationalism as both a product of globalization and a producer of globalization, at least in this field of activity, internationalism that was embodied in the interwar period by the League of Nations was putting the brakes on globalization or even playing a deglobalizing role. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Those were three really wonderful presentations, and we do already have some questions lined up from our audience and panelists. So the first question, actually, Peter and Charlie, would you mind turning your cameras back on so we can have the full panel here? Great. The first question from Vanessa Ogle was for Charles. And she asks, I'm wondering about the labor aspect of your topic about shipping crews working on ocean liners, either above or below deck. On cargo steamships, shipping crews were some of the first white unionized English workers to push back against the deployment of cheap non-white labor of colonial subjects, mostly from South Asia, as crews on British ships as early as the 1910s and increasingly so in the interwar years. So I'm wondering who worked on your ships and what it tells us about precarious labor and possibly a pushback against it.
All right, yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question. I could speak to French and British companies above all, and so it's very interesting because between French and British companies there were agreements, at least on the I don't know how legally enshrined they were, but there were agreements between companies that would limit the employment of Asian and African workers above certain latitudes. So like the P&O, which dominated British shipping east of Suez, agreed with Cunard, I believe, to not let Asian African workers work above certain latitudes. That worked out great for those east of Suez shippers because that meant that they could keep the precarious and very affordable labor. And I don't know exactly when those latitude restrictions broke down, but I know that they held to a certain extent, and you can find the same kind of agreement between the big French shipper east of Suez making an agreement with the big French shipper transatlantic, not to essentially divide their workforces geographically. And yes, from the earliest institutionalization of labor, of organized labor, in the 1870s and 80s, at least in France, there is opposition to the employment of Asian African workers, whether they're colonial subjects or not, and it's often quite vicious. But it didn't really gain that much success because the shipping companies were able to offer the rebuttal that no one wanted to work in engine rooms in the Red Sea, for instance, where I can't give you the exact temperature, but if I told you, you would say it's unbelievable. Nobody could survive in that temperature. And they were able to make a case for the kind of exigencies of navigating colonial waters that obfuscated the attack of those early labor movements. And so as I see it, at least, the war restarts, it gives new breath to that those labor movements, at least in France and Britain, to target Asian African workers as liabilities, as unpatriotic, partly because it brings outright conflict between different, like racialized conflict between workers on ships, especially like the big ocean liners of a Messagerie Maritime or a P&O type company. I don't think it's necessarily successful, but it, in the end, after the war ends, those hiring practices endure. But it does push, at least again, French and British labor movements one step closer to the thing that will actually be somewhat successful, which is interracial labor organizing. That's what I could say about it.
Great, thank you. Next I'm going to group two. We have two questions for David, and I'll pose them both just because I want to make sure we get in as many questions as possible. The first from Fatih Bormesh, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. To David, can you draw a parallel between the League of Nations and the UN in terms of their power to enforce laws or resolutions? I can mention a number of examples that the UN was not able to implement. I'm very skeptical about their role on the international scene. And then a second question for David from Jamie Martin. Fascinating talk. I was particularly interested to hear that original League narcotics control was articulated in terms of the problem of pharmaceutical overproduction, and that the solution proposed was something akin to a kind of international commodity control. Overproduction was widely diagnosed as one of the most serious problems of the world economy in the 1920s and 30s. International restriction plans were the solution, not least because national efforts were seen as insufficient to the nature of the global problem. The analogies here seem rather interesting to the drug control problem. I wonder whether you might clarify if these links are drawn explicitly, i.e. between overproduction of pharmaceutical drugs and of raw materials or primary goods more generally as an economic problem. David.
Great. Thank you for the questions. I'll answer them in reverse order. So the second question about commodity control, raw materials, primary goods, that's a great question. I haven't actually thought about it. I don't have a great answer to that at the moment. I haven't seen the analogies drawn in the drug control documents, but I wasn't looking for them specifically. I sort of came to it through police documents, so it's quite possible it was much more explicit. I would say the one interesting angle that I have seen is that after the 1931 Drug Control Convention, the League Secretariat began to trot this out as an example of how arms control might be achieved. So looking at the successful effort to control pharmaceutical production might then be applied to the global arms industry. But I'm sure there were a lot of analogies and connections between drug controls and the way people were thinking of other economic spheres. I mean, it seemed obvious, and nobody seemed to question the underlying logic that it was a problem of overproduction. So it makes me think that there's sort of a broader climate of thinking that was a problem in many different fields. The question about the UN and the League of Nations is also a very good one. I'm hesitant to give much of an answer because I haven't studied the UN as closely as I have the League of Nations, but I think your instinct is right that in terms of power to enforce laws or resolutions, the League of Nations had, I think, even less maybe than the United Nations, or perhaps it had more power on paper, but less in practice. In drug controls, I mean, I think what was very powerful about the League of Nations was simply getting the world states to sign on to conventions in which they committed themselves to drug control. And it didn't really need to step in and enforce the measures. By and large, the governments would adhere to these drug control measures. And the League of Nations became a site where they could be shamed if they weren't adhering before the international community. And usually they moved to adhere to it. In some cases where national governments weren't adhering, by the 1930s, the United States was stepping in, imposing more aggressive economic pressure on the governments to get them to adhere to these regulations.
Thanks. We have one question that really goes to all of the panelists from David Spreen. Thank you. I loved all these papers. I apologize if this is too obvious, but is there a common operating definition of globalization? It seems to me that's remained largely implicit. What is globalization if it can be contrasted with international cooperation and international institutions? Is globalization just deregulation of trade? Peter, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, certainly. Maybe I can just also add one observation, not from my own work, but from Alison's work, Alison Frank Johnson, from work under Trieste Lloyd, where she kind of very fascinatingly reconstructed this kind of drug trade, where the sailors and officers from West Lloyd ships headed to Bombay, were buying up kind of overproduction of cocaine in Germany. And so in that sense, I think those people who had this idea of an overproduction of drugs, it was factual based. There seems to be kind of an empirical basis. But turning to the question, I think, you know, the way I see this is that you do have, you know, kind of on a global level, kind of exchange of goods, capital, people is always rule-based, and you do have rules which facilitate exchange, and you do have rules which restrict the flow of goods and people and capital. And my own approach is to look at the processes of deglobalization in terms of a kind of a reduction of these flows, a reduction in connectivity, but still related to global regulations. And this, I think, to me, it links up also very nicely to, you know, kind of current experiences in or current debates, for example, on the European level, where you have also a shift back from a stronger integration move towards a stronger empowerment of national government. So in that sense, I see it more as a question of, you know, kind of the way in which these global regulations are used in terms of facilitating or restricting connectivity.
Thank you. Charlie, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I take recourse to a kind of a set of material processes to stand in for globalization that are very similar to what Petr just described, right? Process of economic integration, intensifying of contact, whether exchange-based or not, but just, you know, I mean, obviously, a prime example for me is the setting up of telegraph lines, of the infrastructure of communication. Standardization too, I think, is also a measure that we can kind of put into a bundle of processes that we could then call globalization. The only thing I guess that I'd add, and, you know, I think global historians are really reluctant to ever talk about global as a totality, because they don't want to be taken to be speaking for the whole world. They want to talk about these processes, but there is an idea. Globalization is an idea, also a rhetoric. It's a conjuring up of a totality, I think. So I mean, one thing I would add is just that, and obviously this is a bit more in line with the paper that I wrote, presented here, that it's also an idea that conjures up a representation of the world, right, and that can be used, weaponized in infinitely different ways.
Great. David?
I mean, I think they covered it more or less. I'll keep it very short to just say that I take the point that I think globalization is very hard to define, and there are different ways to approach it. What I was trying to do was look at the way in which international institutions were trying to break up certain forms of interconnectedness, which I think is what Petr was getting at. But I'm quite open to not using deglobalization to describe what I'm describing here. So I could definitely hear an argument to describe this as sort of a transformation or change to globalization or globalizing processes.
Great. We have a few more minutes and we have at least two more questions. I'll try and pose them very quickly, and maybe you can also just keep your answers on the shorter side. And of course, if people have to leave, that's fine. The first question is from Ben Van Zee, and it's a long question. I'm going to consolidate it a bit, but what he's asking about is, he says, the papers we've read for today have made me wonder if economic deglobalization can counterintuitively foster another type of globalization in a cultural sense. So for Dave, we see the fight against a specific sector of the global economy produces a novel internationally shared laws and policing institutions. For Peter Becker, we can see the invention of the passport had the effect of controlling international free movement. At the same time, it streamlined or homogenized the state's institutional structures across the globe, and ocean liners too made possible the globalized world of the 19th century, yet it was because of the prestige and economic usefulness of the ocean liners that we see a fracturing of the industry as more and more states wanted to promote their own ocean liners. So he asks, could the panelists speak to these tensions or the relationship between economic deglobalization and cultural globalization? Is that a useful way to think about it? And then a question specifically for David from Andre Schielachter. Did international drug control also lead to the erection of more rigid national border controls that then affected other flows, such as refugees from Nazi Germany? And finally, I'll throw in one last question for Peter. I was wondering if you see a strong division between states that traditionally were producing immigrants and those that were receiving immigrants in terms of their position on the creation of an international passport regime in the interwar years. Okay, so let's go just in the order that you spoke. First, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, the question of economic deglobalization and cultural globalization is very interesting. I don't have a conclusive answer. What it makes me think of, I gotta say, is kind of a literature that I think is developing of kind of finding proto third world internationalism in the interwar. And I wonder if there aren't potentially interesting links to think about how forms of protectionism and the kind of consolidation of regional blocks, the protecting of regional bloc interests and the resistance to full economic globalization couldn't be linked to a kind of a proto third world consciousness, before it could be articulated. But thinking there's a really interesting book by Michael Denning about music politics, and it kind of speaks to your question. I would just leave it at a very tentative possibility that yes, I think that's entirely possible, and that potentially one place to look for it would be to the places that were not included in what stood for the international order in the period we're talking about.
Great, thanks. Peter?
Maybe on these 2 points, the one point about kind of globalization and kind of economic, cultural, I would just put it very briefly into maybe somewhat different realm of culture. I think the real change is probably the introduction of a new culture of international regulation, with the League of Nations as an organization which produces, not the expected results, but it has an organizational longevity and an organizational power which has, it has the ability to follow track of if people are kind of implementing these agreements or not. So in that sense, I think this organizational change does actually, that seems to me kind of a real game changer here in terms of kind of the culture of regulation. And in terms of the passport and the pattern, it's actually, I found it extremely difficult to establish a clear pattern. Some of these immigration countries were very keen on, kind of reducing restrictions in South America. The United States, independent of passports or not, they were very keen on restricting any kind of access, outside of wealthy tourists on cruise ships. They were given very, happily access to the country. But in that sense, actually, I failed to establish a real clear kind of differentiation beyond that level.
Thanks. David.
Sure. To Ben's question, I think it's a really good point and a good question. I'm not sure I have anything really smart to add to what has just been said, but I think that's an interesting point to think through. the links between economic and cultural globalization. At this point in the exchange on the Q&A chat, I'm more and more unclear and uncertain of what globalization even means anymore. so I'm not sure I want to take a stab at it right now, but thank you for the question. I'll think through it and maybe we can correspond about it. The easier question for me to answer is Andre's question, which I think I can answer fairly directly. I don't see much evidence that it did lead to the erection of more rigid national border controls, but sort of the opposite happened, where the hardening of national border controls and the controls on capital movement in the 1930s made it much easier for drug controls by the police to gain purchase.
Okay, that is unfortunately about all the questions we have time for today, but I just wanted to finish by thanking all the panelists again for their terrific presentations, thanking all of you who came out today, who tuned in. I hope you'll join us again on December 11th for the next session, which will be devoted to the politics of self-sufficiency. We'll have 2 further sessions after that in January and February devoted to the history of capitalism and anti-globalism and deglobalization, and then to contemporary anti-global politics and the far right. All that remains is for me to wish you all a safe and healthy and enjoyable weekend, and say thank you again. Bye.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you all for participating in questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Yeah.